On Monday of this week, journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones gave a speech to the Union League Club of Chicago as part of their celebration of Martin Luther King Day. Hannah-Jones, you may recall, is best known for her leadership in developing the 1619 Project, which was published in the New York Times Magazine in August of 2019 to mark the 400th anniversary of the first African slaves brought to American soil. The 1619 Project places slavery and its continuing legacy at the center of the American story. She updated and expanded it into a book published last year. And as you may know, since the 1619 Project was published, Hannah-Jones has become a controversial figure, vilified as a dangerous radical by some, and others really appreciative of the lens that she has brought to remind us of the legacy of slavery. She began her speech to the Union League Club in this way. It was in the year 1619 that the first black slave was brought to the shores of this nation. They were brought here from the soils of Africa, and unlike the Pilgrim Fathers who landed here at Plymouth a year later, they were brought here against their will. For more than 200 years, Africa was raped and plundered, a native kingdom disorganized, the people and rulers demoralized, and throughout slavery, the black slaves were treated in a very inhuman form. White Americans must recognize that justice for black people cannot be achieved without radical changes in the structure of our society. The evils of capitalism are as real as the evils of militarism and racism. The problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power. A nation that continues year after year to spend more dollars on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. I only read part of what she tweeted later about her speech. And she continued in that same vein for a while, and apparently caused quite a bit of discomfort among the political and civic elite members of Chicago who were part of the Union League Club. And then she paused to let them know that everything she said had been quotes from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The only thing she changed was the word Negro. Instead of saying Negro, she said black, so as not to give away the reality that she was quoting words from the late 1950s and the 1960s. Her speech was a reminder to her listeners that Dr. King was considered a dangerous radical in his time. She noted that white Americans called King a charlatan, a demagogue, a communist, and a traitor. At the time of his death, polling showed more than 3/4 of Americans opposed King, while current polling shows that 94% approve of him now. Her speech was a reminder that in the gauzy hindsight of history, we tend to soften the prophetic edges of Dr. King. We tend to think about the parts we like instead of recognizing how challenging his words were and still are. In hindsight, the world he was working toward makes sense to us somewhat. That's only because we tend to focus on the parts that don't fundamentally shift the social order. We love to recite the part of King's 1963 March on Washington speech, in which he speaks of his dream of a world where little black boys and little black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers, as long as that's in Alabama, as he was talking about. We don't want to talk about our own ways that we weren't living up to that, maybe in California. But we less often hear repeated his 1967 Beyond Vietnam speech, in which he said, "A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring." That is only one of many, many examples of the prophetic and challenging words that Dr. King spoke. He called us to a radical transformation, but we settled for a little temporary school desegregation, a few years of affirmative action, and voting rights for a few more people, but just for a little while. And now, I hope we can see how fragile and temporary that all was, because we didn't have a true revolution of values. We only put a Band-Aid on the gaping wound of injustice. And one could argue that the same thing has happened when we think about Jesus. When we look back to Jesus, in hindsight, we sort of put some smoothness on his radical edges. Jesus was a very, very challenging and difficult figure for his people. The words of Torah and the prophets were written into the hearts of the faithful people of Jesus' time, but the challenge of those words, the call to transformation, could be lost by those people then, by us today. We struggle to hang on to the challenge, and it's understandable. Life is hard. We're just trying to get through our daily lives. And sometimes thinking about the need for that radical transformation of values is a little bit overwhelming. But I think we're called to continually engage with that prophetic tradition. That is the challenge for us today, just as it was the challenge for the people of Nazareth. When Jesus visited his hometown synagogue, Joseph and Mary's son, as they knew him, read from the prophet Isaiah. He read words that the prophet spoke to the people in exile in Babylon. And these were words of comfort for a people who were oppressed. They were also words of challenge. By that point in the first century, these words had come to be seen as a messianic text. The kinds of things that would remind the people that God anointed prophets to bring good news. And there was a hope that God would send a Messiah, an anointed one, to them in the midst of their trouble. So Jesus read, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor." He read that text, he sat down, and he said, "The scripture has been fulfilled." This was a bold proclamation. He was, in essence, saying, I am God's anointed. I'm the Messiah you've been waiting for. So far, so good, or is it? At first, they were excited. Yay, finally, the Messiah is among us. But the more he spoke, the more they began to grumble. Who is this upstart son of Joseph? He made them uneasy, just as the words of Dr. King should still make us uneasy. He challenges them. He suggests that the good news he's bringing is not just for the poor people of Nazareth or the Galilee, the sort of people they're comfortable with, the sort of people who look and act and think like them. He reminds them in the stories he's telling about how God worked through unexpected people, foreigners, strange people who looked and act and thought differently, to bring God's good news to the world. Eventually, they were so enraged by the implications of what Jesus was saying that they tried to kill him. Why? What did he say that upset them so much? Were they the right words coming from the wrong mouth, the wrong words coming from one of their own, or a little bit of both? When a prophet appears in our midst and challenges us to see the world and our place in it a little differently, how can we discern whether these are words of wisdom or words of folly? This is really important for us to wrestle with, because even now, there are many voices all around us that claim to be prophetic voices, that claim to be working towards God's good purposes. And how can we tell the difference between the voice of someone who's bringing good news to the poor or someone who is leading us down a dangerous path? How can we tell the difference between the voice of an authoritarian bent on leading us down a path of ethnocentric violence and the voice of the one who's leading us toward a path that will lead us toward a world of greater justice? There's an important clue to how we discern this difference in this text from Luke's gospel. Jesus' hometown crowd expected that they would be getting some special goodies from God's anointed one, Jesus, Joseph's and Mary's son. Of course, they would get all the special stuff that God had for the world. But the more Jesus talked, the more he made it clear that God's good news is for everyone, all of us. And that made them angry. False prophets encourage us to be selfish, to think that we deserve special favors because of how we look or who our parents are or where we live. False prophets make us afraid of those that are different from us. But God's anointed prophets remind us that God's love is bigger and wider and more radically transformational than we can imagine. The God that anoints Jesus is not content with our smoothed over stories of little children holding hands. God's vision is more radical than that. Jesus bears witness to a God that challenges us to co-create a world in which every child, no matter who their parents are or what they look like, is recognized as God's beloved. So that holding hands isn't seen as astonishing, but it's taken for granted because we have created a world in which all feel free to grab each other's hands with joy. We're not there yet. And sometimes I lament how much Dr. King's prophetic words still must speak to us, still must challenge us about where we are in this moment. Just as I lament how much Jesus' challenge to us still pricks the conscience. We're still being called to bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, to let the oppressed go free, proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. We still must be about the work of transforming the whole Jericho road so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. May God give us ears to hear the prophets of our time and the prophets of our past who make us uncomfortable by calling us toward good news for the poor. The year of God's favor, God's dream of a world in which justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. May it be so.